Some people die slowly, not from illness or accident, but from being unseen for so long. They forget how it felt to exist fully in someone's gaze. I used to think grief was a storm, something that crashes in and shatters everything before moving on. But it isn't. It's a fog. You get used to not seeing the road ahead. You stop trying. The rain had just stopped when I stepped off the curb, boots pressing into the soaked leaves. They made that soft, rotten crunch that always reminded me of autumn's past, bonfires, books, laughter from a voice I now only remember in echoes. My fingers tightened around the umbrella, not from the cold, but from a dull ache that never really went away. My name is Margaret Harris. I'm 54 deputy provost at Hensford University. And last night, I drank a second glass of wine alone, not because I was celebrating anything, but because silence tastes less bitter when it's blurred. The email came at 9:37 p.m., interrupting a rerun I wasn't even watching. Margaret, I was wondering if we could talk about Ryan in person. It was signed Edward Blake, the boy's father. I don't know why I said yes so quickly. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I just wanted to speak to someone whose voice wasn't carried through a screen. Or maybe it was that I hadn't been really looked at, in over 5 years. Not since Tom died. The next day, I sat across from Edward in my office. My hands rested flat on the file, standard behavioral notes. Nothing exceptional. But he wasn't what I expected, not stiff, not defensive. He had a softness about him, like someone who'd been broken gently. We talked about Ryan, his outbursts, his silence, his slipping grades. I mentioned our student support services. He nodded, polite, but distant. It was when he glanced around the room, eyes landing on the worn shelf behind me, that I noticed it, that shift, that pause. "Was that yours?" he asked, pointing at the framed photo of me at 26. Grinning beside a chalkboard, my first lecture, I smiled. A different lifetime. He nodded, and something flickered in the space between us. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. The kind that happens when two people realize they've both survived something invisible. I should have shut it down there, drawn the line. But grief doesn't just kill the part of you that mourns. It hollows the part that remembers boundaries too. That evening, I walked home slower than usual. The lights from the bakery were still on. I stared at the display, not seeing pastries, but imagining what it might be like to sit inside with someone, to have a conversation that didn't end with an automated reply or a pitying glance. At home, I kicked off my shoes, loosened my scarf, and turned on the kettle. Steam rose, curling against the window pane. I stood there, unmoving, watching the world go on without me. I had lived like this for so long. I forgot it wasn't normal. And yet, in that stillness, something stirred, not loud, not wild, but present. The kind of thing that ruins you gently. Some people die slowly, not from illness or accident, but from being unseen for so long. They forget how it felt to exist fully in someone's gaze. It had rained through the night, and the sky hadn't bothered to clear by morning. The pavement outside my flat was still slick, coated in a thin sheen that made the world look as if it had been freshly painted in gray. Leaves stuck to the curb in clusters, brown and gold, like memories that refused to be swept away. I wrapped my scarf tighter. The kettle clicked off behind me. I didn't move to pour the tea. The silence in my flat had grown familiar, not comforting, just known, like a piece of furniture you stopped noticing, until it creaks at the wrong time. That morning, I stood at the window longer than usual, watching a man in a yellow raincoat walk his dog across the street. He didn't look up. They never do. A part of me wanted to knock on the glass. Just once, see if it still made a sound. I was late for work, but not by much. I hadn't been on time for anything since Tom's funeral. It's strange. The things you let go of when grief settles in, like punctuality, like laughter, like the sensation of walking into a room and feeling wanted. At Hensford University, everything looked the same. The iron gates, the cracked concrete near the library's west wing, even the same patch of moss on the philosophy building steps. My feet moved on their own, past the common room, up 2 flights, down the corridor that smelled faintly of instant coffee and worn-out ambition. Office 214, Deputy Provost, Margaret Harris. My name in black vinyl letters, peeling slightly at the edges. I opened the door and breathed in the scent of old paper and dry air. My sanctuary, my prison, depends on the day. There was a file on my desk, thick, red tab, disciplinary case, Ryan Blake, 19 years old, chronic absences, classroom disruption, possible substance use. The usual storm packaged in a too-thin boy with tired eyes and a need to be louder than his pain. I sat, opened the file, and for a moment, I just stared at the first page. There was a photo, blurry, standard id. But something about his expression unsettled me, not the defiance. That was common. No, it was the absence, the hollow look, as if his face was waiting for someone else to show up in it. My phone buzzed. Email from Edward Blake. Margaret, I was hoping we could meet in person to talk about Ryan. I'd appreciate your time. No mention of a convenient hour, just a name, a hope, a small wedge of formality holding together something fragile. I replied yes, before I had time to ask myself why by the time he arrived the next afternoon, I'd already read through Ryan's entire academic history twice. I had underlined certain phrases, isolated tendencies, agitation toward peers, sudden drop in performance. But none of that prepared me for Edward. He was tall, slightly older than me, carried himself like someone used to waiting for bad news, but still hopeful it might not come. His coat was gray wool, buttons polished, a scarf looped tightly around his neck. He shook my hand firm, but not heavy, his eyes green, with a little gold, held mine longer than was strictly professional. Thank you for seeing me, he said. I'm afraid Ryan doesn't say much at home. I thought a conversation might help fill in the blanks. We sat. I walked him through the usual process: support services, academic counseling, the student wellness hub. He nodded, asked questions, took mental notes. There was a moment, barely there, when I looked up from the paper and found him watching me. Not inappropriately, just observant. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had listened to me without needing something. I understand he's been struggling, he said quietly. It's been hard, the divorce, the move. I don't know if I handled it well. I didn't speak right away. Something about his tone made me feel like I was intruding on a private admission. But he had offered it. That counted for something. I'm sorry to hear that, I said gently. Transitions are never easy, especially for young men. His smile was small, worn at the edges, especially for old ones too. That made me laugh, not loudly, but enough that I remembered what it felt like. When he left, I stood by the window again, watched him walk toward the parking lot. He moved slowly, hands in pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. The sky had begun to clear, but the air still smelled like rain and rust. Something about him stayed with me, not attraction, not yet, but something, like the warmth of a light that had been off for too long, flickering back to life. That night, I poured one glass of wine, not two. I sat in the silence. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel entirely alone. It was the scarf I remembered first, not the color, though I suppose it was navy. Not the brand or the texture, but the way it was folded so neatly around his neck, as if someone else had once shown him how to tie it properly, and he just kept the habit. Edward Blake waited by the cafe across from campus, hands tucked into his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on a spot on the pavement that wasn't moving. He didn't see me at first, or maybe he did, and was giving me the space to choose my moment. I crossed the street. Good afternoon, I said, more formal than necessary. He looked up, smiled faintly. Margaret, thank you again. He didn't suggest we go inside, just turned and began walking beside me, as if he already knew we were heading back to my office. We spoke little on the way. The quiet between us wasn't awkward, it was suspended, like a note held too long in a piece of music, waiting for its resolution. Back in the office, I gestured for him to sit. The sunlight had shifted through the blinds, casting slatted shadows across the floor. I could hear the low hum of conversation from the hallway, the occasional laugh. Life happening just beyond our door. He sat with care, not stiff, but with the kind of self-awareness that comes from years of holding things in. I don't want to make excuses for Ryan, he began. He's got a good mind, but lately, he seems to be pushing everyone away. I nodded. We've noticed. His professors say he barely shows up. When he does, he challenges authority more than he engages with the material. Edward exhaled slowly, not in frustration, in something heavier, guilt, maybe. I left his mother last spring, he said. It wasn't clean, I thought, if we moved here, started fresh. It would help. His voice didn't waver, but something behind it did. A fracture, invisible unless you were listening closely. I imagine it's been difficult for both of you, I said carefully. He looked at me then, really looked. And something shifted in his eyes, not vulnerability, exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like he had scanned me and found something broken in the same places. You don't have children, do you? He asked. I shook my head. No. He didn't push, just nodded, as if that explained more than it should have. I tried to redirect us, asked about Ryan's interests, what he responded to, what made him shut down. Edward thought for a moment. He used to be into music, he said. Guitar, nothing classical, just noise. But it gave him something to hold. That stayed with me, not the guitar, the idea of needing something to hold. I think I may have something, I said, reaching for the activities list on my desk. We have a jazz club. It's not mandatory, but it might be the kind of discipline he doesn't expect. Edward's mouth twitched in what might have been a grin. Jazz, he'll hate it. Exactly. He laughed then, a real laugh. It changed the room. And just like that, we weren't talking about Ryan anymore. There was a moment where I should have ended the meeting, stood up, offered my hand. But I stayed seated. He shifted in his chair, looked down, then back at me. I've been meaning to ask, he said. Ryan's failing calculus. Do you know anyone who tutors? It was an innocent enough question, but I felt my pulse change. I used to teach it, I said before I could stop myself, before administration. I suppose I still remember enough. Would you? He asked. Of course. We exchanged numbers, strictly professional, strictly academic. But his fingers brushed mine as he handed me his phone, and it wasn't a mistake. He thanked me again, said my name softly when he stood. Margaret. I watched him go, then sat back down. The sun had shifted again, falling in stripes across my hands. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. The Blake house sat on a quiet lane just outside the old railway station. A semi-detached, red brick structure with creeping ivy along the edges, and a garden that looked like it had once mattered to someone. I stood at the gate longer than necessary, clutching the strap of my bag, pretending to check the time, though I knew I wasn't late. The front door opened before I knocked. Edward gave me that same small smile, kind, guarded. Right on time, he said, stepping aside. The warmth inside surprised me, not just the heating, but the scent. A mix of rosemary, something citrus, and fresh laundry, comforting in a way that caught me off guard. Ryan was already in the living room, slouched on a low armchair with his arms crossed. He didn't look up. Hi, I said gently. He muttered something that sounded like acknowledgement. Edward motioned toward the kitchen. I'll give you two some space. There's tea if you want any. Then he was gone. I took a breath, unzipped my bag, spread the calculus notes on the coffee table between us. We'll start simple, I said. I promise no pain. Ryan didn't laugh, just looked at me with that look only teenagers can master, somewhere between boredom and accusation. I launched into derivatives, trying to make my voice steady and conversational. He stared at the page like it had wronged him personally. Still, he followed silently. I could tell he understood more than he let on. Every so often, he'd ask a question not to learn, but to test me. I didn't mind. It was his way of showing up, but my focus kept slipping. The light from the hallway shifted as the sun dipped lower. I could hear Edward moving in the kitchen, a spoon against porcelain, a cupboard closing, the hum of a man at home. When Ryan paused to write something down, I caught myself watching the door. I turned back quickly. "That's good," I said, pointing to his notebook. "You got the sign right." He shrugged, but a corner of his mouth moved barely. Almost a smile. We worked for 45 minutes, not effortless, but not strained either. Eventually, he stretched back and let out a sigh. "That's probably enough for today." I nodded. "Fair." He stood and disappeared upstairs. Without another word, the air changed. I gathered my notes slowly, gave myself time to settle, then stood, walked toward the kitchen. Edward was standing at the counter, pouring tea. "Still like you're strong?" he asked without turning. I hesitated. "You remember?" "I remember a lot." He handed me the mug. Our fingers touched, just barely. And again, not by accident, we stood there in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, just full. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said. "Neither was I." I took a sip of tea. The warmth spread fast, deeper than the drink itself. There was a pause, then something softened in him. "You don't have to do this, you know, the tutoring. I didn't ask out of obligation." I didn't say yes out of pity. He looked at me then, really looked, like someone cataloging every part of your face before the moment passes. "You're good at this," he said. "I used to be. You still are." Something in my chest twisted, gently, a reminder of who I had been before the quiet settled in. I placed the mug down. "I should go," I said. Though my feet didn't move, he nodded. "Of course." I walked to the door. He followed. At the threshold, I turned. "Thank you for the tea." Anytime. Outside, the evening air wrapped around me, cold, honest. I walked back to the street with my hands buried deep in my coat pockets, heart louder than it should have been. And I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because I already knew he was still standing there, watching. The third tutoring session took place on a Friday evening. It had rained again, not heavily, just enough to make the garden path glisten under the porch light. When I stepped up to the Blake house, I could hear the soft buzz of music inside, not from Ryan's room, but from the kitchen jazz, something slow, brassy, full of longing. A deliberate change. Edward opened the door. No scarf this time, just a navy jumper, sleeves pushed up, the veins in his forearms catching the low light in a way I hadn't expected to notice. "You're early," he said. 2 minutes, I smiled. "I call that punctual." He stepped aside. "Ryan's finishing dinner. You want tea?" I nodded. "Please." The kitchen was warm. There was something simmering on the stove. Tomatoes, maybe basil. a hint of garlic. Edward moved without hurry. He knew his space. He reached for 2 mugs, poured without asking how I took it. "Same as last time," he said. "I'm guessing you're a creature of habit." Trying not to be. He handed me the cup, and I held it tighter than needed, just to anchor myself. The table had been cleared, except for a textbook and 2 pens, already laid out. He'd done that, not Ryan. The boy appeared a moment later, hoodie pulled up, earbuds hanging loose around his neck. "You can use the dining room," Edward said to me. "Bit more space." Ryan gave a grunt that passed for agreement and trudged over. I followed. We worked. This time, Ryan asked more questions, not to challenge, but to understand. There was a shift, a willingness. He didn't smile, not fully, but his tone was less sharp. He still slouched, still sighed too loudly, but he stayed with the equations. We made it through the chain rule barely. After an hour, he stood without a word and headed upstairs, muttering something about needing a break. I let him go. I gathered my things slowly, still thinking through his last answer, trying to find something useful to say if he asked again. Next time, Edward leaned in the doorway. "He do better. He's not hopeless, just angry." He nodded, arms folded. "We all carry something." I looked at him, really looked. There was a tightness in his posture he hadn't shown before, a tiredness, barely masked. I wondered how often he had to be both parent and witness. How often he stood in that kitchen, cooking dinner for 2 people who barely spoke. "You okay?" I asked. He exhaled, gave a half laugh. "I was about to ask you the same." "Fine." We both knew it was a lie. He gestured toward the couch. "You don't have to rush off." I hesitated. Then I sat. The lights in the room were dim, just the lamp beside the bookshelf and the flickering reflection of the TV in sleep mode. No sound, no distractions. Only the quiet beat of breath between us. He sat beside me, careful not to touch. There was a stillness in the air, not tense, not quite heavy, but aware, charged, in the way a sky feels just before a storm, not dangerous, but thick with the possibility of it. I found myself talking about a novel I was reading, nothing profound, just a story about strangers meeting in unlikely places. It surprised me how easy it was to speak around him. He listened fully, without interruption, without waiting for his turn to speak. "You seem different," he said after a pause. "Different from when?" "From the first time we met, like you've remembered something." I wasn't sure what to say to that. I turned to him. "And you?" Trying to forget something. There was no need to ask what. We all had our ghosts. His just lived upstairs. The silence returned, deeper this time, not empty, just full of all the things we weren't saying. Then, in a moment that neither of us seemed to plan, his hand brushed against mine on the cushion, not firmly, just the edge of his fingers grazing mine like a question. I didn't move. I didn't answer. But I didn't pull away. The next time I arrived, the house felt different, not colder, not darker, just quieter, like something had been peeled back since our last conversation. The jazz was gone, replaced by the ticking of a wall clock I hadn't noticed before. A small sound, steady and unforgiving. Ryan was already at the table, arms crossed, eyes low. He didn't say anything when I walked in. I set my bag down gently, as if noise might offend him. We worked in silence for the better part of half an hour, the air between us thick, not with tension, but with something heavier. The kind of silence that forms after someone has decided you're not worth the energy to fight anymore. Eventually, Ryan spoke. "You don't have to come here." I looked up. He was staring straight ahead, not at me, not at the book. "I know," I said quietly. "You think this helps, but it doesn't. You're just part of the noise now." There wasn't anger in his voice, just weariness, like he'd said it all before to people who didn't hear him. I closed the textbook. "You want to talk about it?" His eyes met mine, hard, clear, "Do you?" And that's when I knew he had seen it, felt it. Whatever small, flickering thing had passed between his father and me, he'd been watching from a different room. Maybe not the moment itself, but the shift, the gravity of it. "You think I don't notice?" he asked, voice flat. "The way he looks at you, the way you sit closer now, like this isn't about me anymore." I didn't speak. There was nothing to deny. He stood up. "Pretend this is just tutoring." He left the room, footsteps heavy on the stairs, leaving the door open behind him like a warning. I stayed seated, listening, waiting for Edward to appear. He didn't. After a while, I gathered my things, heart hammering too loudly in my chest. I found him in the kitchen, wiping down the counter like it mattered. "He knows," I said. Edward looked up, the cloth pausing in his hand. His expression didn't change. I figured. "He thinks we're—" I didn't finish, couldn't. "We're not," Edward said softly. "Not really. But we could be, and he knows that too." The room was too bright, the overhead lights humming louder than usual. "I shouldn't come anymore," I said. Edward looked at me. Something unreadable moved across his face. "I don't want this to ruin him," I added. "You're not ruining him," he said. "He's already drifting. You just make it visible." We stood like that for a long time. Two people caught in a moment neither had planned. With nothing solid to hold on to then, he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until we stood close enough to feel each other's breath. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. "I see you," he said. The words undid something in me, something I hadn't realized was still knotted. I turned away. "I have to go." Outside, the night had deepened, the air sharp against my skin. I didn't cry. I didn't breathe too deeply. I just walked. The sound of my footsteps, the only thing reminding me I was still moving. I didn't look back. But I knew this time he wasn't watching. Monday came heavy, draped in fog. The windows in my office were clouded, and no matter how many times I wiped them, the moisture crept back. A quiet rebellion. I sat at my desk, blinking at an email I'd read 3 times already. Words had begun to lose shape lately, sentences blurred. My mind slipped too easily. Alina, my assistant, knocked lightly. "Staff meeting in 10, she reminded me. I nodded. though I'd already forgotten what the meeting was for. When she left, I looked down at the pen in my hand. I hadn't been writing, just holding it, like a relic of someone else's routine. At the meeting, I tried to focus: numbers, proposals, a debate about funding for student counseling. I heard my name once, twice, but I wasn't sure what they wanted. Afterward, I lingered in the corridor longer than I should have, watching students shuffle past, laughing, arguing, alive. My reflection in the vending machine glass startled me. I looked tired, hollow, like someone fading by inches that evening. I walked home instead of driving. The cold helped. It made everything sharper. My breath hung in the air, my boots echoing against wet concrete. When I reached my street, the lights in my flat were still off. I stood at the gate, then kept walking. I found myself in a small bookstore tucked beside the post office. It was quiet, warm, smelling of paper and rain-damp wool. I wandered until my fingers stopped on a worn copy of a novel I hadn't read in years. I didn't buy it, just held it. Like the pen earlier, like maybe objects could anchor you when your thoughts couldn't. Back home, I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the dark, guided by muscle memory, coat off, kettle on silence. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the empty chair across from me. I don't know how long I stayed there later that week. Edward texted, just checking in. Let me know if Ryan still needs help. I didn't reply, but I read it again and again. I knew what it meant. It wasn't about calculus. It wasn't about his son. It was about presence, about the shape we leave in a room, even after we've walked out. I didn't sleep much that night. My dreams were scattered, half-formed images, soft voices I couldn't understand. In one, I was standing in the Blake house again, but it wasn't the kitchen. It was a narrow hallway, endless, the doors on either side locked. I kept walking, waiting for one to open when I woke. My throat was dry, my pillow damp. I got up, opened the window. The street below was quiet. A single car moved past, then nothing. I let the air in, cold and biting. And for a brief, shivering second, I thought I heard someone whisper my name. The knock on my door came just after 6. I hadn't expected it. I wasn't dressed for guests. Still in the soft cardigan I wore only on days when I didn't plan to be seen. It was Edward. He looked like he hadn't slept. Jacket unzipped, shirt rumpled, the color in his face drained slightly, as if the outside world had pressed too long against him. I'm sorry to come by, he said. I just didn't know where else to go. I stepped aside. The flat was dim. I hadn't turned on the main light, only the small lamp near the window. Its glow pooled gently onto the rug, catching the edge of the table where papers still lay scattered. He sat without being asked. I stayed standing for a moment longer. What happened? Ryan, he left. My heart knocked once hard. He packed a bag, said he needed space, took the train to his mother's, didn't even look at me. I moved to the kitchen, poured water into 2 glasses, hands slower than usual. He'll come back, I said, though I couldn't be sure. He's hurt. That doesn't mean he's gone. Edward took the glass, held it but didn't drink. I think I broke something in him. Or maybe he just sees me too clearly. He paused, looked around the room, eyes landing on the shelf where I kept the framed photo of Tom. A younger version of me stood beside him, both of us smiling. Caught in some forgotten summer, Edward's voice dropped. Do you miss him, your husband? I nodded. Every day. But not just him, the version of me who existed with him. He set the glass down. I'm not sure I know who I'm supposed to be anymore. There was nothing performative in his sadness. It wasn't designed for sympathy. It simply was. I sat across from him. I felt invisible for years, I said, and then you showed up. And for a moment, I remembered the sensation of being noticed. He looked up. His eyes were wet, not with tears, but something more restrained, regret, maybe, or exhaustion. We didn't do anything wrong, he said. Maybe not, I replied. But maybe that's what makes it worse. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it trembled. I keep thinking, he said, if we had met 10 years earlier. But we didn't. He leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. His jaw moved, like he was swallowing words he'd never say. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar pull of something unspoken, how need and shame sometimes were the same face. Then he reached for my hand, not boldly, just enough to rest his fingers near mine. His warmth radiated across the small space between us, like the edge of a flame brushing the skin. I didn't move. I didn't lean in. I just closed my eyes. And in that stillness, a wave rose, not of desire, but something older, wounded, human, the kind of ache that doesn't demand anything, only to be seen, to be known, to be allowed, even briefly, to exist in someone else's quiet. We stayed like that for a long time, until the sky outside darkened, until the lamp's bulb buzzed softly in the silence, until there was nothing left to say that wouldn't undo us completely. I took the long way that morning, not because I had somewhere to be, but because the quiet helped. The streets were nearly empty, the kind of pale light that only happens when winter hasn't quite decided to stay. I passed the bakery, the church with its locked doors, the little shop with scarves in the window that I'd never once gone inside. I found myself standing outside the cemetery gates before I knew why. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked, row after row. All that stone, all those names. The wind moved through the trees without urgency, as if the world had grown used to loss. Tom's grave was just as I left it last time, nothing dramatic, just a flat stone, his name, the year. A simple quote he'd once said in passing, now etched into permanence. I sat on the bench nearby, pulled my coat tighter. I didn't speak aloud. I never did. But I let the silence between us fill with everything I hadn't said since he died. I told him about Edward, not in detail, just enough. Enough to confess that something had stirred in me again, something terrifying, something alive. And then I said I was sorry that the version of me who loved him had gone quiet, that she had waited too long for permission to feel anything else. I stayed until the air shifted colder, until the bench beneath me felt less like a place to rest, and more like something meant to be left behind back home. I opened my old journals, the ones I kept when I was still teaching, before the promotions, before the slow erosion of my voice beneath layers of responsibility. The ink was faded, but I remembered each sentence. Passion, clarity, wonder, words I hadn't used in years. They were all still there, waiting. Later that night, I wrote a letter, not to Tom, not to Edward, not even to Ryan, to myself. I wrote what I wished someone had said when the grief first came. I wrote about forgiveness, not as a gift you receive, but as something you give yourself when no one else will. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. Then I tore the page out gently, folded it once, and lit a match. The paper curled in my sink, catching flame like it had been waiting its whole life to be light. The smoke drifted upward, soft and silver, and I watched it rise until there was nothing left. The corridors felt narrower when I returned. Everything was where I left it, papers stacked too neatly. The forgotten plant on the window sill, still reaching for a light it never received. Eleanor greeted me with her usual warm efficiency, but there was something careful in her eyes, as if she didn't want to ask where I'd been. I didn't offer. Instead, I walked into my office and closed the door behind me more gently than necessary. The silence welcomed me like an old coat, familiar, worn, too heavy to discard. There were emails to answer, reports to sign, a week's worth of normal waiting to resume. And I did it all. Not quickly, not brilliantly, but I did it at lunch. I walked to the quad. The leaves were beginning to turn again, gold and rust, pressed against the pavement. The air had that crispness that made you breathe a little deeper without meaning to. And then I saw him, Edward, standing just beyond the fountain, not moving, not hiding, just there. We didn't wave. We didn't speak, but his eyes found mine and held long enough to say what neither of us needed to repeat. It's done. It's okay. Later that afternoon, I found a folded note tucked between the pages of Ryan's textbook. Just a scrap of lined paper. Thanks for not pretending. There was no signature, but I knew. I sat with it for a while, the paper soft between my fingers. Then I tucked it in the back of my drawer, behind old schedules and memos no one would ever look at, not to forget it, but to keep it. A small truth, quiet and unassuming, proof that sometimes showing up, even imperfectly, is enough. The lecture hall smelled of dust and old carpet, the kind that never quite goes away, no matter how many windows you open. Rows of students filed in, their chatter low and scattered like birds before a storm. I stood near the podium, fingers resting on the edge of the lectern, watching them find their places. It had been a long time since I taught anything beyond policy memos and faculty memos. But they'd asked for a guest speaker on emotional intelligence in education, and I'd said yes, before I could talk myself out of it. The room quieted. I cleared my throat. I used to believe intelligence was about what you know, I began. Now I think it has more to do with how you carry what you've lost. The words hung in the air longer than I expected. I told them stories, not from books, not from case studies, but from life, small ones, about silence, about showing up, about how sometimes the hardest part of learning is accepting that not every question has a clean answer. They listened, or at least they didn't check their phones. Afterward, a young lecturer approached me in the hallway. I liked what you said, she told me, about loss, about carrying it. I smiled, tired, but honest. It carries us too. She asked if I had time for coffee sometime. Not awkwardly, just curiosity. A reaching out, I gave her my email. Not a promise, but not a no. I stepped outside into the courtyard, the early afternoon sun breaking gently through the clouds. The trees were still shedding, and the ground was soft beneath my feet. I didn't go straight home. I walked through campus instead, past buildings I once knew like the lines on my palm, past benches worn by laughter and arguments and long waiting hours. The library windows glowed faintly. Warm with lamplight, I paused there, letting the quiet fill me somewhere inside. Students were reading, learning, beginning. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for something to return. I was simply here, alive and moving forward.